in town. I'm going home tonight. Yeah.
Remember that letter that you wrote to me concerning the computer aid program?
Mm-hmm. I did.
Yeah. Peg has found a copy of it, and I want to attach that as part of the backup material for support to Bev. We're making sure that that thing is approved. And I was going to have him send it to me in the mail, but
I can get it tomorrow.
Okay, tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon?
Yeah.
I'll tell her you'll swing by there.
Yeah, you're talking to Peggy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can pick it up tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You bet. What do I do with it then? Will you give me some instructions? Give it to Mary? Yeah, okay. I'll pick it up.
Okay, now what were you going to say?
Okay, I was going to tell you that I'd like to have you tell me what it is that you envision doing with this.
Okay.
You and I talked about
And
a couple of ideas, but I need to refresh my memory as to what purpose this little project will serve.
okay. I'll tell you my initial thoughts on it, but also that
It's going now, I guess, so we'll
Yeah.
have it up. Yeah, okay.
and then I'll expect feedback from you and maybe what a desire you might have to utilize this format as me reporting or interviewing you in a sense. Okay, and that could be kind of a platform for you to do something that you
Yeah.
might want to do. So we could set it up that way. I've entitled.
If I decide to run for president of the United States, will it serve as a very sound platform in which to launch a major campaign?
Well, if you would decide to burn it, I'll give you that freedom. I won't hold it against you. But anyway, I've entitled our project "The Establishment of the Patterns of Education in Alaska." So, what my desire is to look at what has been established in education as the patterns of how we're accepting as normal and natural way to bring up youth in our educational system. It's kind of like we can set back and look back at it all instead of thinking that we're already in the middle of something that just has to be, in a sense that something totally different could have happened if at certain crucial points different patterns were set into action or set underway. And so what I want to do is review history-wise these establishments of how education was formed here and how those patterns at crucial points might have been set in motion. So so I'm looking at for your insight on that. I'm not sure how versed you are in the actual histories, the back to the beginning of it all when the missions first started, whatever you're versed in as far as seeing that, or we can go and research certain things that we might wonder about too. And so the aim of it is to, once we look at that and look at those crucial points, to see how things perhaps are wrong or things could be different. That's pretty general.
Yeah. But that's all right. That's a starting point. I'm wondering to what extent we should maybe take it in periods, chronological portions, say like pre-1900, and have you do a little bit of a research effort to see what shaped the educational system in Alaska, up to 1900. And then I think we could take it, say, from 1900 to World War II, when Alaska, because of its location, took on more of a significance in its location and the impact of the military population in the state, particularly in Anchorage and Fairbanks, throughout various sections of Alaska. And then take a period of time from, say, the end of World War II to statehood, 58, and then from statehood to the present. Those seem like natural dividers for you?
Yeah, that seems pretty...
Because I think the portion up to 1900 is pretty sketchy, be my guess.
Yeah, I have been doing...
and maybe you've looked at this. Sheldon Jackson, I think, was involved in the early 1900s, wasn't he? In 1915, 1920?
Even before
30,
that.
Even before that?
Yeah. I have been studying this some, and we can see that the best example was set by Father Innocent. I'm sure you've heard of him. I forget what his Russian name was exactly. Viminov or something like that. But anyway, he, his example of going out and learning the native language and setting up a whole format of education for the natives was very exemplary at that time. There was a Father Duncan who ran Metlakatla, who did it as he epitomized more of letting a very minimal amount of white culture into the native culture, but just enough in order to make them feel useful.
Was he was the one who was instrumental in having the community move from
one place,
from British Columbia over to Annette Island, right?
Right.
I went through, by the way, the original Metlakatla village site this summer when I brought my boat up, and I went to Prince Rupert, and there's a little place called Metlakatla. It's the original town site of Metlakatla prior to the move. I went through there with the boat. It's interesting.
It's abandoned now. So.
Yeah, there are some people living there, and a number of houses, and it's interesting.
Yeah. But then it was pretty much, it was like the different churches, denominations of churches, where each took like a section, a certain amount of villages in a certain area, and then they made kind of a mutual vow not to tread on each other's claims, so to speak, and they were pretty much respected, in mutual respect of what the others were trying to do, but it was pretty much in the hands of the church authorities, like the major hierarchies of the church authority were aware of what their missionaries were doing, and so it was by the government from the time that Alaska was turned over as a territory to the United States up until something like the late 1890s. The government didn't do anything until finally Sheldon Jackson, when he became the some kind of commissioner of education of some sort to the territory. He got some appropriations of funds and started to do a little bit with that.
Like he had $30,000 for 2 years or something like that.
Something like that. And then, but then with the Organic Act after that, and I think more happened perhaps.
Yeah.
Mainly, it seems like I was doing some reading on it last night again, and my feeling was that there's almost like a natural equilibrium that always happened when people with educational intents came into the villages or came into anywhere in Alaska in order to teach or in order to feel like they were going to civilize the savages. There's always kind of a natural equilibrium. They had to give up a lot of their preconceptions on what they could do, and of course whatever they did bring in, these were somewhat absorbed by the natives, and patterns were kind of set forth in that way, mutual give and take.
Did you get into the impact of Catholic missionaries and the Moravian missionaries? besides the missionary effects of Sheldon Jackson, well, I was wondering if you had a chance to see the other.
Specifically what they no, but it's possible. I did find one book that talks specifically about Moravian influence on the Eskimos. That's all I saw as far as particular church that could be looked at.
Okay, and if we go ahead and begin to talk about some of the things that have shaped education over the years, then we might want to use this information for some kind of an article that you might want to write, or that I might want to write at some point in time. Just kind of use the information for your own personal knowledge because of your interest in education and Alaskan education, the history of it.
Yeah, I think that what a person needs, this holistic sense of what's going on in education in order to truly effect some kind of change for the better. I think there's always progressive change, so that if one feels himself going to always be helping in that progressive change in education, they need to have this holistic sense of what has happened and what's going on. And, but also I feel like, that there's a value in the sense that I have a desire to just immerse myself in understanding how education works in Alaska, and your sense that you've worked with it for 12 years, and the fact that we can spend time transferring information and making certain investigations.
Now, as you look at some of the books that talk about the history of education in Alaska, have you seen any kind of an outline or a format that they followed that we might be able to apply to each of these time segments? In other words, does it talk about the governance? Does it talk about the personnel involved, or the involvement of the people, or the inclusion of local values, or language, or the overall culture in the curriculum? I guess what I'm searching for is how we might best package our components of each of these.
I think that's a good point, because
and I don't know. I haven't thought what's the best, and I was just wondering if maybe in any of your reading you've seen anything that we could just take it and say, okay, this is a nice way to organize the content, and we could probably have a consistent application with each of these different time periods. And I don't know, maybe not. Maybe that would limit us too much. But I'm just kind of thinking of how to get it, get geared up to approach.
Well, actually, that's a good point. But I feel like that it's unprecedented, this kind of thing. What is available is chapters and books on Alaska history in general, which mention the beginnings of education. They all seem to just focus on the beginnings of the education, and then on the other hand, there's our modern researchers who take specific issues and perhaps will put up together a whole paper on a specific issue and maybe follow its history back. But no one has generally looked at trends or how certain patterns have been set in motion. So I guess what we need to do is define certain patterns, maybe define those patterns, and then look at further origins and then follow them from there.
Mm-hmm. if you took the issue of the indigenous languages of Alaska, and you followed the treatment, if you will, of the language, that indigenous language, over the time periods we're talking about. And what if you took the issue of adolescents' presence in a community over the same period of time? By that I mean, in the history of Alaska education, did we see a period of time where there was a strong pitch to have the youngsters stay in the community, to help strengthen the family, to work for the family, versus an emphasis to have the youngster leave the community, leave the family, and go off to a government school, a church school, whatever, to supposedly obtain the skills of the Western culture. And at the same time, a emphasis to de-emphasize the indigenous language patterns in that particular. And I wonder if we could identify a couple of variables, a number of them, such as that we could begin to trace and see what happened and who was promoting it one way or the other, and whether or not there was any sign of any kind of impact, and then we could follow right on up to the present time.
Exactly.
And, like this business of adolescence and family or at home versus adolescence not being in a community and not being an integral part of a family after 16 years of age or whatever. And were there patterns set up where teenage youth, the adolescents, even prior to the time schools were the issue, that it was understood and it was just a part of village life that these youngsters would, after being 16 years of age or 15 years of age, would be involved with uncles or other family members, extended family members, to the point where they either moved out of the village or took on other responsibilities. I'm just kicking around some things, trying to wonder if there might be some rather unique approaches to this, if we look at things besides textbook and outside trained teachers and that. Look for a few of these things that may have indirectly shaped our whole educational program without anybody ever giving it a second thought.
Exactly.
I think, Dave, this is kind of what you're getting at. And I know languages, maybe this whole business of family structure, and the residency patterns of adolescence in Alaska villages over the years may have shaped more than what education and what we ever thought about. Maybe
So that, in a sense, is like one of these whole patterns we can look at.
yeah, that's just a possibility.
Yeah.
And just kind of brainstorm. The other thing was community members' involvement. Community members' involvement in educational decision-making, or that sounds too formal. And, is there such a thing as a pattern that exists regarding the involvement of the community through whatever kind of council or tribal group or village group in this, whatever, is there some kind of a pattern of involvement by a certain segment of the community in the learning experiences of youth, that you see it happen for a certain period of time, and then it's an educational process, but it's an informal educational process, and then we see a growing of the formal aspect of education handled by some other agency, and a decrease on the informal involvement by the local community, and then we see begin a leveling off and then a coming together of the two or something. I guess what I'm looking at is are there some things that speak to the elders or the adults of a community playing a role in what kids learn and shaping their experiences in a way that we can see any kind of significance to that over time. That, again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, looking for some different ways perhaps of analyzing what's happening out there, what happened. Maybe out left field, but it's... I guess what I'm doing is I'm throwing some things out here in hopes that maybe, as you take it from a different viewpoint, not having been involved with the system and grown up with the system, where you're coming in, you can look at things differently, and maybe you can see some relationships that I can't see after having spent 20-some years in the system.
Exactly.
I'm trying to throw out a few creative ideas as to how we might examine this. So we look at language, we look at adolescent residency patterns, we look at the involvement of, for lack of a better term, significant others, if you will, in the educational process. And then, of course, we can look at the changing patterns of education for what? What is it that people have in Alaska have wanted for education for years? To maintain subsistence lifestyle, is to be able to have subsistence lifestyle capabilities as well as the non-subsistence lifestyle patterns. Where does it all break down?
When you first came into office, did you feel like there was any of that looking back, or did you feel like you were just suddenly, hit with an onset of current responsibilities, this and that? You didn't even have time to think about how these things have come about upon you, and
very little time to look back. Very little.
It was always dealing with
always, reacting.
Reacting, right?
Being pushed here, pushed that way. Legal action, legal action, legal action. Political. That's just the way things move. There's no overall master scheme or plan to build on the experiences of the past and say, 5 years down the road, we're going to do this. 4 years, things happen so fast. None of that. The kinds of things you and I are talking about were discussed, in a sense, when we dealt with the certain aspects of the small secondary schools and the creation of the new school districts, but not in any great detail. Some of it was very emotional for people, and I remember a lot of the hearings. Parents would say, the state has taken our kids, the federal government has taken our kids away, sent them off to school. We don't want any more of that. We want our kids at home. There was a film made of a family in a monarch very fine documentary. You ought to take a look at it sometime. I'm sure that there's a copy around where you can get it. Of a family that was interviewed regarding their feelings about kids going off to high school. It was done in the early 70s.
Remember the name of it?
No, I think you can find out.
Okay.
It's a good film. Interesting. Very interesting. Done about 73, 72. Somewhere in that time period. 71 maybe. And it helped build the case that, hey, there's some serious problems. In fact, people ought to take that film out and remind themselves what took place during that period of time. Start talking about the successes or the failures of the small schools. It's an impressive film.
Yeah, it seems like that, you know, whether you're saying that everything was happening so fast and that the political forces and such moving that there's no time to be sensitive as to what's proper or not. It's almost like a mass of people with only a half awareness of what's going on, putting things together from their half awareness and never making a whole, and not being sensitive to what's needed. And they just go forward with it, and they just plow over things.
Classic example right now, you may have heard last week the state board did some things with approving some programs for Mount Edgecombe. There's talk about Mount Edgecombe's going to open this coming fall. And they're going to have a Pacific Rim influence part of the curriculum. Japanese will be a required language. Everybody before be a part of the requirements for high school graduation when you're Japanese. And then there will be a familiarity with the Japanese culture will be required. At the same time, there's the accepted fact that unless that school opens by September, the land and all of the buildings will revert back to the federal government. It's millions of dollars worth of real estate. Are the decisions regarding the expediency of the curriculum or the program being made on the basis of what's in the best long-range interests of education, or are they made as a way to catch on to the present interests of the legislature and the governor on Pacific Rim and a valuable piece of real estate? Or, you know, is it truly an educational? My guess is that it's real estate and the catchiness of the Pacific Rim notion first. And then whatever else can be done to emphasize the educational need come along.
Because that's the kind of people in power. It's the people who know about real estate and know about the political ins and outs.
Nobody's intentions are improper. They're all honorable. You know, they're trying to do the best. But these are the forces that temper the decision-making process. They're a fact of life. And, you know, the people putting the program together, putting the curriculum together, getting ready to hire teachers and go out and recruit students have to start moving like hell because there isn't all that much time between February and September to build a whole new program, get the staff, get the students lined up, put all the pieces together. It's a real tight time frame. And I mean, you don't build a school overnight, especially with something that is going to have an emphasis that is atypical of what you find in the curricula of most of the public schools in the state. You follow me?
Exactly.
Now,
so the value of what we can do here is to find these points at when those kind of forces made the decisions, when there was a more sensitive decision for the long range effects which could have come about, you know, to find those points and then to address those issues again, to say if they're at all addressable at this time, but to say that now here we are, the result of these decisions, we're living the results of those decisions that were made.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can address them again. People maybe aren't even thinking about them at this time, but now we can say, look what happened.
Yeah.
This is why this is happening. People.
See, this whole business of the purposes of education is I think is very important, because I'm almost of the opinion I ought to take time and write an article that says, all right, you got projecting 175 youth to go through that school for $3.8 million. That's in excess of $20,000 per student for 1 year of schooling. Okay. Should we be saying we will create a fund? We'll take the same amount of money, set it aside for youth who choose to go on into a vocational area, a true vocational area, where they can actually get honest-to-goodness vocational education, not at some high school, where you can get it as vocational education in my view, or post-secondary academic at the university or community college, whatever. Set that money aside. Say, hey, you're going to have to live with the fact that your high school is small. But we recognize that as a result of your coming from a small high school with limited opportunities, that here is a fund for you to draw on when you're out of that high school, to enable you to pursue the kind of program that you are best suited for and that you're interested in at a point in time of your own maturity and career decision-making, where that money might very well be much better utilized for you as an Alaska resident than for us to spend $20,000 a year on you to go to this specialized high school. I think an argument can be made that it'd be far better investment for both student and state in the long run than to put it into a program. First of all, you set up a system of options for a select group of kids who happen to reside in small communities, an option that my kid cannot go and get the same $20,000 option. Now, if locally in Juneau they're spending $4,000 a year per kid, or $5,000 a year to send the kid to high school here, or pay for the high school education of the kid here. And I know that there's a $20,000 option because the kid's going to get fed and he's going to have housing and the whole thing, and Japanese language. Now, how come I can't get the $20,000 option for my kid? Right. Now, I think it's much easier to say, okay, we're going to provide a high school education the best we can for all the kids in the state, regardless of where they live. The fact that the community is small means, very small, means that it's going to be limited in the curriculum. But we probably can provide some good basic skills for the kids. The specialized portion, which is the part that comes after for the vocational training or academic, comes after the high school. We'll make that available to these youngsters who come from the small community with a certain amount of that money. In fact, if we look carefully, we could probably take all the high school graduates of the state, let's say there are 5,000 of them, and have a fund set up for every high school graduate of the state and give them $4,000 for their first, whatever it is, $4,000 for their first year of post-secondary education, or $1,000. Gives you $5 million. Give them $1,000 as the shot for every high school graduate in the state to get their special training. I mean, there are other ways to cut the pie on this thing. Because what we're doing is we're setting up a situation that is going to be much more unfair to everybody involved than anything we've done before. Nobody argues with the fact that it costs more money to educate a kid in a small village than it does in a large community. They can understand that. The option part is going to be very difficult for people to understand. When the option is not available to all kids, and there is no requirement for parent participation in paying for that extra cost, See, the other approach to take is to say, all right, you're spending $5,000 here in Juneau. It's going to cost $20,000 per kid to Mount Edgecombe. I want my kid to go to Mount Edgecombe because there's something unique about that program. Fine. Then I should pay the difference between the 5,000 and the 20,000. I'll put in the $15,000 to let my kid go there. Isn't that right? You know, that's not a native, non-native issue. It's an issue of fairness by virtue of residency. And, you know, that's got to be worked out, and that's going to have a very, very significant impact on the attitudes of a lot of people, especially in the education. You know, I think we need to think that one through very, very carefully. I'm in favor of a specialized program. I'm in favor of options. But at whose expense? Will it be other kids who are going to have to pay because their budget's going to be cut back so that the special school can be set up to deal with the inadequacies of existing small high schools? I don't think I want to defend that. You?
Not at all.
It's not right.
But they're going ahead with that.
That's what the news leads one to believe. Do they want to prepare the people for a vocational skill? If so, there are various ways we can prepare people for vocational skill. Do they want to prepare them for advanced academics? If so, there are ways we can deal with advanced academics. Anyway, I didn't mean to get sidetracked here, but I guess the point I'm making is that here are some decisions being made in a reactive mode, tempered by valuable real estate and a series of politics. All around a so-called educational need, which, if dealt with, will create some inequities in educational opportunities for a whole series of other kids. And, you know, they will lose sight of that, and then 10 years there'll be some guys sitting around talking like we're talking and say, how come we're in a, you know, what has shaped the educational system in Alaska in 1995, or the year 2000? What were those forces? That's going to be a big part of history of education in Alaska being shaped by the availability of surplus governmental institutions. That has had a big impact on Alaska. That's the classic example of a surplus military installation rather, that has shaped a lot of education. That's the old World War II naval base. That's one of them. I'd like to know the history of Wrangell Institute, what the original mission of Wrangell Institute was. Was it designed and built to serve as a school? I think maybe Wrangell was, unlike Mount Edgecombe. That has an interesting history. That closed 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And there was a lot of jumping up and down about the closure of Wrangell Institute. 2 years after it was closed, it just kind of died away. As Mount Edgecombe did, but it did not try to resurrect it. Governmental institutions played a role in other communities, I'm sure. I know it.
As far as the government being there, establishing the fact that there's so many children that need to be educated?
Well, they came in with another function initially, abandoned that function like a military installation, and then the installation became available, so So then we mold an educational program to fit into that facility. We bring kids to go to that facility. That's what we did at Mount Alaskan. We had them come from all over the state. Most of them weren't from Southeastern. But here was this abandoned military base. And the kids there. Anyway. See what other variables we could talk about that might play a part of this.
Before you mentioned something about examining the whole transition of the BIA schools.
Yeah. Trying to think what I meant by what I had in mind now. Part of that would come just as the role of the federal government in the history of Alaskan education. And that in itself would be an interesting topic to deal with. How they first got involved as a Alaskan Native Service, Alaskan Indian Service. And then how they provided different services throughout the years.
Well, I'll focus on some of these topics and some research this week and
Think about it. Yeah, I don't know. I've never thought about how to best organize some of the major threads that flow through the history of education.
it was unprecedented. And,
Yeah, it might be kind of an interesting way to put it all in perspective, shape it. And maybe there, as we talk
make
about
some exposés.
yeah, there might be some interesting themes that run through this. I'm sure there are. And I guess our primary interest here is in rural. But so much of Alaska was rural up until just very recently. When you look at the whole history of the state, that's unnatural. We've been rural up until, for the most part, up until the last 25 years. All of Alaska. So see what you can do with that. Kick it around a little bit. I want to think some more about it too.
Yeah,
And
see
the
what
fun
you
part
can-
about this is that it stimulates some thinking.
Absolutely. See what you can come up with too. Think maybe back on your, when you were moving so quickly in your office there, back and forth, and suddenly, something might have faced you to question something, but then you almost didn't have time to pursue it. Maybe at this time that can be
Yeah.
pursued.
Yeah. That got me thinking about
Okay, well,
reflecting a little bit on history. Yeah, it's fun.
I'll try
Just
to.
as it's fun to project a few of the things for the future that might happen. But see what you can do with it. You might have a good project.
Okay.
We both might have a good project, huh? You think we both become rich and famous?
It's not it's not our original aim.
Well, maybe we can come up with something people can use and serve as a halfway decent document for people to look at. There needs to be a capturing of some of the thoughts which we might want to develop further as the years go on.
The years go on, exactly. Because in examining the patterns that have established education, then we can set forth the proper patterns. Okay. you.